Chapter 13, the income approach. The income approach is based on the principle of anticipation. We've looked at the cost approach, we've looked at the sales comparison approach, and both of those are based on the principle of substitution. There is some substitution in the income approach as well, but it's mostly anticipation. The value of any property is based on the present worth of future benefits. So in this slide here, we have different types of income producing properties. We have multifamily residential. That includes large and small apartment buildings. We have commercial buildings. That would be things like retail stores, offices, medical offices, hospitals, hotels, motels. And then we have industrial properties like warehouses and factories. Out of these three different categories, which one do you think is the most common type of income producing property? The most common type of income producing property is multifamily residential. Now here we have the motives and benefits of property ownership. We have intangible benefits, and then there's also tangible benefits. So let's look at the intangible first. We have the pride of ownership. Makes people feel good when they own something. We have a sense of security. It also gives people that sense of security when they have different things that they own, that particularly income producing, that's bringing in an income stream. We also have personal opportunities that are involved in property ownership, developing your management skills, things like that. There's also tangible benefits to property ownership. We have the return on the investment, which is going to be the interest earned or the profit. And then we're also going to have the return of the investment. This is the money that you originally invested in the property that is recovered whenever you sell the property. So there's lots of different ways that you can invest your money. In this example, we have Charlie, who has a savings account. And Charlie has a certain amount of money that he has in the bank, and they're giving him a 6% return on the money that he is holding in the bank. If Charlie gets $36 as an annual check, which is 6% of whatever it is that he has on deposit, how much does he have on deposit? The answer would be 600, right? 600 times 0.06 is $36. Now, this is not realistic. If you have a savings account, you know good and well that the rate that you are getting with the money that is in that account is less than 0.25%. It's terrible. But if you invested your money in property and you sold that property, is it possible that you could get a 6% return or even higher than that? The answer is yes. So in this slide, we're comparing income generating investment with a personal savings account, and an income generating investment is always going to win out when you compare it to something like a savings account at a bank. So this chapter is all about income capitalization, the income approach to appraisal. Capitalization is the process of converting an income estimate into a value estimate, and there is a formula that you use to do that, and it's listed here. I'm going to show you another version of this that I like a little bit better. I like to look at the formula from this perspective. I like the income on the top, the rate on the left side, and the value on the right side. So what we have here is income, rate, and value. As long as you have two of these variables, you can figure out what the third variable is. Now, the horizontal line is going to indicate division. The vertical line is going to indicate multiplication. So we have income divided by rate will give you your value. We have income divided by value gives you your rate. And then we have rate multiplied by your value gives you your income. So why do we use the income approach to appraisal? The rationale behind this is that the current value of a property is a function of the income stream that it's expected to produce. This is what we call income capitalization. We're converting our future income into a present value. The income approach is based on the premise that a property's market value is a function of the income that you are expecting to produce on that property. And so whenever we're calculating the income approach to appraisal, the first thing that we have to do is figure out what our income actually is. Now there's two different types of capitalization. We have direct capitalization, which is for a 1-year time frame. And then we have yield capitalization, which looks at the entire time frame that you intend to hold the asset. So if you intend to hold the asset for 5 years, you're going to look at it for a 5-year time frame. If it's for 10 years, you're going to look at it for 10. So we have direct and we have yield. Direct capitalization is what we're going to focus on in this class. The income approach is always based on the mathematical relationship between income, value, and the rate of return on your investment. Now, whenever we're doing the income approach for an income-producing property, we have to estimate what the net operating income of that property is. The net operating income is calculated by deducting from the property's rental income all expenses associated with operating and maintaining the property. Where are we going to find this information? You can look at similar properties in the market and see exactly what their net operating income is versus their expenses. That's very similar to the principle of substitution that we use in the sales comparison approach, where we look at comparable properties. One of the things, though, that's really unique about the income approach is we can look at the historical experience of the subject property itself, unless it's brand new, and then we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But if it's a property that's been in existence for 10 years and they have rental income that has been coming in for a 10-year time frame, you can look at the historical experience of the subject property and it's going to give you a ton of information. When we're calculating the income approach, we have what we call this reconstructed operating statement, and these are all the different categories where you have to find information. So the first thing that we have is the potential gross income on the property. We're then going to figure out what our vacancy and collection losses are for that specific property. If there's any miscellaneous income, we're going to add that in. That's going to give us our effective gross income. Now we're going to subtract our operating expenses and our capital expenditures. Once we do that, that gives us our net operating income. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of these different categories and talk about them a little bit more. So the very first step in the income approach is potential gross income. We have to estimate what our highest potential income would be on this property. So we're assuming rental income, 100% occupancy, there's no losses, everyone's paying their rent, everyone's paying it on time. Now we know that that's not necessarily realistic, and so we have a category that takes that into consideration. But you have to start with your highest potential. So if everything is occupied, everyone's paying their rent, what is the amount of money that you would have coming in on this specific property? Now, one of the things I wanted to mention here is the difference between contract rent and market rent. Most of you have a lease on the house that you live in or the apartment that you live in. Your lease is a contract. It is a legally binding agreement. The lease says you're going to pay X amount of dollars each month, say $500, okay? That is contract rent. Contract rent is exactly what your lease states because your lease is a contract. So now, what would market rent be? I'm sure that some of you have friends here in Statesboro who probably pay a little bit more than they should for where they live, okay? The market is supporting a little bit more when it comes to rent, maybe because the apartment complex is new and that's where everyone wants to be, right? So market rent is going to be what the market itself would support. Now, there are some situations where the market rent could be less than contract rent, or it could be more than contract rent. I always give this example of my husband. He has an office in Statesboro, and his rent has stayed exactly the same for about 15 years. And the people who are right next door to him downtown pay about $400 more a month. But his landlord is not requiring him to pay any more. So the market will actually support a lot more than what his company pays. But his landlord doesn't really care. She just wants them to send her that check because the building's paid for anyway. And so she just has stuck with this specific amount that we originally agreed to, and that's what you're going to pay, and she's happy with them because they always pay it, they always pay it on time. So there is a very specific difference sometimes between contract rent and market rent. Sometimes, however, contract rent and market rent are exactly the same, okay? So as an appraiser, from an appraiser's perspective, you need to figure out, are you going to use contract rent or market rent? Now, here's the thing. there are some situations where you might be appraising, say, a retail strip mall, and the retail strip mall has a 20-year lease on it. When you're looking at commercial buildings, a lot of times the leases are for really long time frames. So if you're 5 years into a 20-year lease, then you're going to have to use contract rent because you're not going to be able to change what they have agreed to pay for the next 15 years. However, if you're in, say, a small apartment building where the leases go through every year, then it's possible that you could increase the rent so that the market would support a little bit more. And then whenever you're doing your appraisal on that specific property, you would use market rent versus contract rent. With regards to market rent, there's two terms I wanted to mention here. The first one is overage rent. Overage rent is also percentage lease. Okay? This is how this works. A lot of times when you have a retail space, you'll have a base amount that you'll pay for rent. And then according to whatever your sales are, you have to pay a percentage of your sales to the landlord. And they do this in retail strip malls, they do this in shopping malls, because the landlord says, you're doing all of this business because you're in a prime location. So you have a base rent that you pay, and then there's a percentage over that that you pay based on what your sales are. That is what we call overage rent. We also have excess rent. Excess rent is defined as the amount of rent that exceeds market rent. So those friends of yours who might be paying more than what the market actually supports because the apartment complex that they're in is brand new and that's where everyone wants to be, that's what we would consider excess rent. So here we have our contract rent. This is the amount that you have agreed to pay. This is the agreement between the owner of the property, the landlord, and the tenant. With regards to contract rent, there's lots of different types of tenancies. We've talked about some of those in this class already. There's lots of different types of leases. So some of them are listed here. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk about the ones that I feel are important for this course. But there's different types of rent and leases. There's different responsibilities for expenses. Some types of leases allow the landlord to pay most of the expenses. Most of them, however, when they're income producing properties, the tenant is going to pay most of the expenses. So what I would say when we're talking about contract rent, make sure you know exactly what the contract says. Read the lease. Know what your responsibilities are. So here we have some examples of the most common types of leases. The first one here is a straight lease. This is where you have level lease payments. I guarantee you, most of you, when you're paying your rent every single month, you pay the same amount, right? It's a straight lease. So the amount that you pay does not change. You also have step-up or graduated leases. This is where the rent is going to increase at a predetermined schedule. So before I sold real estate, I had a retail store in Statesboro, and it was a 5-year lease. And what they did is every single year, the rent would increase by 10%. So if it started out as $1,000 a month, the second year it would be $1,000 plus 10%. The next year it would be $1,100 plus 10%. And then every year it went up by a predetermined amount. So you knew exactly what you were getting yourself into. You also have indexed leases where they're tied to an inflation index, so it could go up or down depending on what's happening there. And then we have percentage leases. This is where you pay a base rent, and then you also have to pay a percentage of whatever your sales are. And as I mentioned in a previous slide, this is very common in shopping centers, shopping malls, because the landlord is saying, yeah, you know, you're getting all of these sales because you're in a prime location and I provided that for you, where it may just be your marketing, right? But that's one of the ways that they get a little bit more as they tack that percentage lease on there, and they get a percentage of your sales in addition to your base rent. So let's do an example of an income approach with an office building. We have a property here. It has 9 office suites. There's 4 on the first floor and 5 on the second. We are paying contract rent. So 6 of the suites are $1,800 a month and 3 of them are $1,400 a month. Our annual market rent increase is 3% per year. Vacancy and collection losses are 10% per year. Our operating expenses are 40% of effective gross income, and capital expenditures are 5% of effective gross income. With CenterPoint Office Building, the very first thing that we have to figure out is what is our potential gross income. So on the first floor, we have 1,000 square foot suites. There's 4 of them at $1,800 a month. times 12. Now remember, in this class we are doing direct capitalization, which means that we are looking at this from a 1-year time frame. So you always have to multiply the rents times 12. So we have 4 at $1,800 a month times 12. That's going to give us $86,400. So that is our potential gross income for the first floor of this office building. On an exam, please don't forget to multiply by 12. On the second floor, we have 800 square foot suites, 2 of them at $1,800 a month times 12. And then we have 3 of them at $1,400 a month times 12. If you total that together, you get $93,600. If you add the first and the second floor together, that gives us a potential gross income for Centerpoint at $180,000. Now the next thing that we have to figure out, if you think back to our reconstructed operating statement, we have to figure out what our vacancy and collection losses are. Now, where does this number come from? If this is a property that has been in existence for a while, you can look at the historical experience of it. What are the vacancies for this specific office building in this example? And they gave us a vacancy rate of 10%. So when you have a building that has historical experience, you can certainly use that. If you have a building that is new, then you might want to look more at competing properties in the market, because that's going to give you a better idea. Another thing that you can look at is what we call the natural vacancy rate. Areas have a natural vacancy rate, and it depends on where you are, obviously, as to how high or how low that rate's going to be. In Bullitt County, for instance, our vacancy rate ranges anywhere from 5 to about 15%. And that makes sense because we have a lot of students here, and they might live in one apartment or one house for 1 year, and then they move out, and it takes a little time. Once someone moves, you have to clean the apartment or clean the house and get it ready for someone else to move in. So you might have a month where you don't have any rent coming in. So anywhere from 5 to 15% makes sense to me. The next thing that we have to calculate is our miscellaneous income. So miscellaneous income can come from several different sources. It could be garage rentals, it could be parking fees, it could be laundry, vending machines, clubhouse rentals. These are just examples of some of the types of things that you might see in miscellaneous income. Okay, so let's look at our Centerpoint office building. We figured out that our potential gross income is $180,000. Our vacancy and collection losses were 10% of potential gross income, so that's $18,000. In this example, we did not have any miscellaneous income, so that would be 0. When you subtract your vacancy and collection losses from your potential gross income, that gives you your effective gross income. The effective gross income here is going to be $162,000. Now we have to figure out what our operating expenses are. When we're looking at operating expenses, we're only going to include property-related expenses. This is very important because we don't want to include owner-related expenses. Owner-related expenses are going to be things like the loan and the interest payments, the income taxes, the depreciation of the property. We're not interested in that. And the reason is because we're trying to figure out what the potential of this property is as a standalone structure. How would it support itself? The reason, too, that we're excluding owner-related expenses is because owners could have different expenses. One owner might pay cash for the property and he has no loan and interest payments. You might have one who finances 50%. You might have one who finances 100%. So owner-related expenses are not going to help you here when you're trying to figure out, can this property function on its own? Does it have enough income coming in minus the expenses to support itself? Now we have several different categories for operating expenses. You have variable expenses, we have fixed expenses, and reserve for replacements. So variable expenses are going to change with occupancy. So this would be things like utilities, water, gas, maintenance, supplies, trash disposal, management fees, accounting fees, legal fees, that kind of thing. And then we have fixed expenses. Fixed expenses are going to remain the same for the year. So taxes, insurance, It might go up the next year, but for 1 year at least you know what they are. And then we have reserve for replacement. This is also referred to as capital expenditures. So you might see it either way. So it's the same thing. Make sure that you know that. These are expenses that increase the value of the structure over time. These are things that you're not going to have to pay for every single year, but eventually you're going to have to fork out a little bit of money to replace something to keep the property functioning properly. So examples of things that would go in this category would be things like replacing the roof, replacing an air conditioning system, maybe resurfacing a parking lot, putting in new carpet, replacing a water heater, replacing appliances, things like that. Okay, so now we can figure out exactly what's going on with CenterPoint. We had already calculated our effective gross income, which was $162,000. And now we have operating expenses, which are 40% of effective gross income. So that's $64,800. And then we're subtracting capital expenditures or reserve for replacements. Remember, you could see that written either way. That was 5% of effective gross income. So that's $8,100. When you subtract all of the expenses from your effective gross income, that gives you your net operating income of $89,100. So we just calculated our net operating income. Now our ultimate goal is to figure out the value of CenterPoint. So the next thing that we have to do is calculate the rate. You know, in sales comparison approach, you go back and you look at comparable properties. With the income approach, we're going to do the same thing. So in order to figure out what the rate is, we're going to go back and look at comparable properties. We have 5 different ones listed here. And all you need to know in order to figure out a rate is going to be the net operating income divided by the sale price, because remember, these are comparables. Comparables are always properties that have recently sold. So we have, say for comparable A, first year net operating income of $80,000 divided by the sale price of $825,000. That gives us a rate of 0.097. They did this for all 5 of these comparables, and then they averaged the rates that they found. So the rate now that we're going to plug into our formula is 0.099. Well, we found it. So we have our net operating income of $89,100 divided by our rate that we found with our comparable properties of 0.099. If you take your income divided by your rate, that gives you your value. So the value of CenterPoint Office Building is $900,000. We have different income and expense ratios. This refers to the relationship between the various income and expense categories of income producing properties. So there's several different ways that you can do this. What about the gross income multiplier? The gross income multiplier is a unit of comparison, and it is the most popular income capitalization method used by appraisers. Why, you ask? Well, because it's a little simpler. The gross income multiplier helps the appraiser compare the subject to the comparable property by using an economic measurement of the property's usefulness. For instance, rent. Isn't rent what's really important? This is a very effective tool when properties are bought and sold on the basis of gross income. Why is it simpler? Because expenses are not considered, so it's easier to calculate. All you have to know with the gross income multiplier is the income and how much the property sold for. That's going to give you a gross income multiplier that you can then apply to your subject property. The gross income multiplier can vary according to some of these different categories that are listed here. It could be location, it could be amenities, number of units, expense ratios, size of units, services included. So the gross income multiplier can vary, obviously, in different areas, but it's still a very reliable tool that appraisers like to use. Here we have an example of a reconstructed operating statement. We have our gross income, we have our vacancy and collection losses. There isn't any miscellaneous income that I see on this example. Yes, yep, laundry facilities, there we go. We also have all of our expenses. We have them listed in different categories: variable, fixed, reserve for replacements. And when you subtract all of your expenses from your effective gross income, that gives you your net operating income. So just take a look at this. We're going to do some examples that are very similar to this example here. So take a look at this and make sure you understand the order and all of the different categories. That's going to wrap up chapter 13 for you guys. And next we're going to move into chapter 14 where we're going to talk about income capitalization rates and techniques.